You're 3 miles from your truck when you hear it, that low, distant rumble rolling across the valley like freight train wheels on old steel. Most folks would keep walking, maybe pick up the pace a little. After all, it sounds far off. Storm's probably 20, 30 minutes out, right? Wrong. That rumble you just heard, that's your 30-second warning, maybe less. And what you do in those next 30 seconds, not 30 minutes, can mean the difference between telling stories around the campfire later and becoming one of the roughly 400 Americans who get struck by lightning every year. Now, I'm not trying to scare you away from the outdoors. Hell, if you're 60 or better, you've probably spent enough time outside to know that fresh air and open country are what keep a man's soul right. But here's the thing about thunderstorms that separates them from every other danger you might face out there. They don't negotiate. They don't give you time to think it over. And they sure as hell don't care how much experience you think you have. I learned this lesson secondhand from a man named Earl Hutchins, a cattle rancher from outside Cheyenne, who'd been reading Wyoming skies for 43 years. Earl could tell you what the weather would do 3 days out just by watching how his horses stood in the pasture and which way the cottonwoods bent their leaves. Old-timers like Earl don't just look at clouds. They read them like a book written in a language most of us never learned. But even Earl almost didn't make it home one July afternoon in 1998. Earl was checking fence line about 4 miles from his ranch house when he heard that rumble. Same sound you might dismiss as distant thunder. But Earl had something most of us don't, a healthy respect for what lightning can do. Learned from a lifetime of watching storms roll across plains that stretch to the horizon with nothing to stop them. Thunder don't travel, Earl told me years later, sitting in his kitchen with coffee that could strip paint. Lightning makes thunder, so when you hear thunder, lightning's already happened. And if you can hear it, that lightning was close enough to kill you. Think about that for a minute. Every time you hear thunder, every single time, you're listening to the sound of air being superheated to 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit in a fraction of a second. That's 5 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The shock wave from that instant heating is what creates the sound we call thunder. And the rule every meteorologist will tell you is simple. If you can hear thunder, you're within striking distance. But here's what they don't tell you in those basic safety courses. Sound travels at about 2,100 feet per second. Light travels at 186 miles per second. So, when you see lightning and then count the seconds until you hear thunder, you're not timing how far away the lightning is right now. You're timing how far away the lightning that already happened was when it happened. Earl knew this. So, when he heard that rumble, he didn't count to 30 and divide by 5. He didn't look around for the nearest tree or try to figure out if he had time to make it back to his truck. He dropped to the ground right where he stood, in the middle of an empty pasture, and went into what old cowboys call the lightning crouch. Now, if you've never seen a lightning crouch, it looks about as dignified as you'd expect. Picture a man squatting on his toes, knees pulled up to his chest, hands covering his ears, head tucked down. Earl later said he felt like a damn fool, crouched in that pasture like some kind of prairie dog. But feeling foolish was better than feeling 30,000 amperes of electricity coursing through his body, because that's exactly what happened next. The lightning that hit the ground 15 yards from where Earl was crouched didn't announce itself with a dramatic buildup. There was no Hollywood moment where the air crackled with electricity and his hair stood on end. 1 second, he was squatting in the grass feeling ridiculous, and the next second the world went white-hot and silent, then exploded into sound so loud it felt like getting punched in the chest by an invisible fist. When his vision cleared and his ears stopped ringing, Earl found himself looking at a scorch mark in the earth that looked like someone had taken a blowtorch to the ground and drawn a jagged line 3 feet long. The smell in the air was like ozone and burned metal. His hat, which had been on his head when he crouched down, was now 20 feet away, blown clean off by the shockwave. But Earl was alive. If I'd been standing up, Earl told me, or if I'd been under that oak tree 50 yards off, or if I'd tried to run for the truck, I'd have been done for. Lightning don't care if you're a good man or if you've got cattle to feed or grandkids coming for Sunday dinner. Lightning just does what lightning does. Now, you might be thinking this is just one man's story, one close call that doesn't prove much about thunderstorm survival in general. But Earl's experience illustrates something that separates people who survive lightning encounters from those who become statistics. They understand that when it comes to thunderstorms, there are no small mistakes, only fatal ones and lucky breaks. The difference isn't intelligence. Some of the smartest people you'll ever meet have died in thunderstorms because they tried to outsmart physics. The difference isn't physical fitness. Lightning doesn't care if you can bench press your body weight or run a 6-minute mile. The difference isn't experience either. Plenty of experienced outdoorsmen have been killed by storms they thought they understood. The difference is respect. Bone deep, no fooling around respect for what you're dealing with. See, most of us go through life thinking we can manage risk by understanding it. You wear your seatbelt because you know car crashes happen. You check the oil in your truck because you know engines seize up. You don't lean a ladder against power lines because you know electricity kills. These are all rational responses to known dangers. But thunderstorms operate by different rules. They move faster than your rational mind can process. They strike in places that seem safe and avoid places that seem dangerous. They kill people who do everything right and spare people who do everything wrong. They turn your accumulated wisdom about managing risk into a liability because they reward the kind of immediate, instinctive response that bypasses thinking altogether. This is why thunderstorm survival isn't really about knowledge, though knowledge helps. It's about developing the right instincts and then trusting them completely when the chips are down. Earl developed those instincts over 4 decades of watching storms roll across Wyoming. But you don't need 40 years of ranching experience to understand what Earl understood that July afternoon. You just need to accept a simple truth that goes against every problem-solving instinct you've developed over 60-plus years of life. When you hear thunder, the time for planning is over. The time for analysis is over. The time for weighing your options is over. The only time you have is right now. And the only question that matters is whether you're going to trust what you know about staying alive in a thunderstorm, or whether you're going to trust your gut feeling that you've probably got time to figure something out. Earl trusted what he knew. He went low, stayed small, and waited it out. The lightning that could have killed him struck 15 yards away instead of 15 inches. Was that luck? Maybe. But Earl put himself in a position where luck could save him. He didn't put himself in a position where only a miracle could save him. That's the difference. Now, you might be wondering how you develop those same instincts. How do you learn to read the sky like Earl read the sky? How do you know when that distant rumble is your cue to drop everything and find safety? And when it's just noise from a storm that's moving away from you? How do you tell the difference between thunder that's announcing danger and thunder that's just making conversation? More importantly, how do you know what to do when you're caught in the open with nowhere to go and a storm bearing down on you like a freight train with attitude? Those are the right questions to ask, and the answers might surprise you, because some of the things you think you know about lightning safety, things that seem like common sense, are exactly the kinds of mistakes that get people killed. Take that oak tree Earl mentioned, the one 50 yards away. Most people would have run for that tree. It's natural shelter, right? It's tall enough to block rain, sturdy enough to lean against. It seems like the obvious choice, except trees, especially tall, isolated trees, are lightning magnets. And when lightning hits a tree, it doesn't just stay in the tree. It travels down through the trunk and spreads out through the root system, electrifying the ground for 30 feet in every direction. So that oak tree that looks like shelter, it's actually a 30-foot radius death trap. But how do you know that if you've never learned it? How do you override the instinct to seek the tallest, most solid-looking shelter you can find? This is where understanding the enemy comes in handy. And make no mistake, in a thunderstorm, lightning is your enemy. Not because it has anything personal against you, but because it follows rules that don't care about your safety, your experience, or your good intentions. lightning looks for the path of least resistance to the ground. Usually, that means the tallest object in the area, but not always. Sometimes it means the object with the most moisture. Sometimes it means the object with the most metal. Sometimes it seems to pick targets completely at random, though there's always a reason if you understand the physics. The point is, you can't predict exactly where lightning will strike, but you can predict where it's most likely to strike, and you can make sure you're somewhere else when it does. That's the first principle of thunderstorm survival. Don't be the most attractive target in the area. Earl understood this instinctively. When he dropped into that crouch in the middle of the pasture, he wasn't trying to hide from the lightning. He was making himself as small and uninteresting a target as possible. He was betting that the lightning would find something else to hit, and he was right. But Earl had something else going for him that day, something that might have saved his life even more than the lightning crouch. He'd been watching that storm develop for 20 minutes before he heard the first rumble. See, Earl didn't just react to the thunder. He'd been reading the signs long before the thunder started. He'd noticed the way the wind shifted from south to west. He'd watched the clouds building and darkening on the horizon. He'd felt the air pressure drop and seen the way his cattle bunched up under the cottonwoods near the creek. Earl knew a storm was coming long before the storm announced itself, and that knowledge gave him options that he wouldn't have had if he'd just been reacting to the sound of thunder. This brings us to the second principle of thunderstorm survival. The best way to survive a lightning strike is to see it coming far enough in advance that you can get out of its way. But how do you do that? How do you read a sky like Earl read the sky? How do you separate the signs that matter from the signs that don't? And what do you do when you read the signs correctly, but you're still caught in the open when the storm hits? Those questions get to the heart of why some people walk away from close encounters with lightning and others don't. The answers have to do with understanding not just what lightning does, but how it thinks. If you can call the behavior of 100 million volts of electricity thinking. More than that, the answers have to do with learning to think like lightning thinks, to see the landscape the way lightning sees it, to understand which targets look attractive and which ones look boring. Because when you're caught in a thunderstorm, you want to be the most boring target lightning has ever seen. Earl figured that out in 30 seconds of listening to distant thunder. It took him 43 years to develop the instincts that let him make the right choice that fast. But the actual decision, drop low, stay small, wait it out, happened in the time it takes to blink. The question is, when your 30 seconds come, will you know what to do with them? And make no mistake, if you spend enough time outdoors, your 30 seconds will come. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but sooner or later, you're going to hear that rumble when you're too far from shelter and too close to danger. When that happens, the difference between getting home with a good story and not getting home at all will come down to whether you understand how lightning hunts and whether you know how to make yourself invisible to a force of nature that can turn a solid oak tree into splinters and kindling. Earl's story is just the beginning, because surviving that first lightning strike was only half the battle. What happened next, in the 20 minutes after that bolt scorched the ground 15 yards from where he crouched, taught Earl lessons about thunderstorm behavior that you won't find in any safety manual. Lessons about how storms think, how they move, and how they choose their targets. Lessons that could save your life the next time you hear that rumble rolling across the valley like freight train wheels on old steel, and you realize you're about to find out just how much you really know about staying alive when the sky starts shooting back. Earl Hutchins stayed in that lightning crouch for another 3 minutes after the bolt hit, listening to the rumbles getting closer and watching the sky turn from gray to that particular shade of green-black that old ranchers know means business. But here's the thing. Earl noticed that most people would have missed, crouched there in the grass with his ears still ringing from the thunder. The lightning that had just missed him wasn't random. It had hit the exact spot where a metal survey stake had been driven into the ground 40 years earlier, back when the county had come through to mark property lines. The stake was long gone, rusted away to nothing, but enough iron had leached into that soil over the decades to make it a more attractive target than the spot where Earl was crouched. Lightning, Earl realized, doesn't just look for tall objects, it looks for conductors, and it has a memory longer than most folks give it credit for. That observation got Earl thinking about all the signs he'd been reading that afternoon, signs that had told him a storm was coming long before he heard that first rumble. Because the truth is, by the time you hear thunder, you're already playing catch-up with a storm that's been broadcasting its intentions for the better part of an hour. Your grandfather knew this, even if he couldn't explain the meteorology behind it. Hell, especially if he couldn't explain the meteorology. The old-timers who lived and worked outdoors developed a feel for weather that modern forecasting still can't match for one simple reason. They paid attention to details that don't show up on radar screens. Take the way Earl's cattle had bunched up under those cottonwoods an hour before the storm hit. Modern meteorologists will tell you that livestock can sense changes in barometric pressure, and they're right, but they'll explain it in terms of pressure differentials and atmospheric physics, when what matters for survival is simpler than that. When animals start acting nervous for no obvious reason, start paying attention to the sky. Earl's horses had done the same thing, moving from the open pasture to the fence line closest to the barn without being driven there. His border collie, Rex, had spent the morning pacing the porch instead of lying in his usual spot by the water tank. Even the damn chickens had gone quiet, huddled in the hen house like they were expecting trouble. Now, you might not have cattle or horses to watch, but if you spend time outdoors, you've got your own early warning system walking around on four legs or flying overhead. Deer will move to lower ground hours before a storm hits. Birds will stop singing and start gathering in sheltered areas. Even insects change their behavior. Mosquitoes and flies become more aggressive right before a thunderstorm, like they're trying to get their business done before the weather turns nasty. But animals aren't the only early warning system available to you. Your own body is a pretty decent lightning detector if you know what to pay attention to. That tingling sensation you sometimes feel in the air before a storm, the way the hair on your arms stands up for no reason you can identify, that's not your imagination. That's your nervous system responding to the electrical charge building up in the atmosphere. See, lightning doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It builds up gradually as ice crystals in storm clouds collide with each other, creating static electricity on a massive scale. As that electrical charge increases, it starts affecting everything around it, including the electrical impulses that run your nervous system. Most people dismiss that tingling feeling as nerves or humidity or just their imagination. Big mistake. That tingling is nature's way of telling you that you're standing in an electrical field strong enough to power a small city, and it's getting stronger by the minute. Earl felt it that afternoon, about 20 minutes before he heard the first thunder. Started as a subtle sensation, like the feeling you get when you rub a balloon on your shirt and then hold it near your head. But it got stronger as the storm approached, until the hair on his forearms was standing straight up, and he could feel electricity in the air like a presence. It was like the whole world was holding its breath, Earl told me. Everything got real still, real quiet. Then the air started to feel thick, like you could almost grab it with your hands. That's when I knew I was in trouble, even though I couldn't see the storm yet. This brings us to what park rangers and search and rescue teams call the 20-minute rule, though most folks who spend time outdoors have never heard of it. The 20-minute rule is simple. From the time you first notice the early warning signs of a developing thunderstorm, you have about 20 minutes to get to safety before the lightning starts flying. Those signs include the animal behavior changes, the electrical sensations, the sudden shift in air pressure that makes your ears pop, and the characteristic change in wind direction that happens when a storm system moves in. 20 minutes sounds like plenty of time until you realize how fast 20 minutes can disappear when you're 3 miles from your truck and the nearest real shelter is 5 miles in the opposite direction. This is where reading the sky becomes more than just interesting folklore. It becomes a survival skill that could save your life. Earl's grandfather, who homesteaded that same land back in 1923, used to say that weather forecasting was like reading a book written in a foreign language. The words might look strange, but the story they're telling is always the same. Storms don't sneak up on you if you know what to look for. Take cloud formations, for example. Modern meteorologists have fancy names for different types of clouds: cumulonimbus, mammatus, lenticulars, but your grandfather probably just called them storm clouds and left it at that. The names don't matter. What matters is learning to recognize the difference between clouds that are just passing through and clouds that are looking for a fight. Storm clouds that mean business have a particular shape and behavior that's unmistakable once you know what to look for. They build vertically instead of horizontally, stacking up into the atmosphere like giant gray monuments. They have hard edges instead of the soft, fluffy boundaries you see on regular weather clouds. And they move with purpose, not drifting with the prevailing winds, but pushing against them, creating their own weather patterns as they go. But here's what the Weather Service won't tell you in their forecasts. The most dangerous storms are often the ones that don't look particularly impressive when they're still developing. Earl learned this the hard way on 3 separate occasions, including that afternoon when he nearly got fried in his own pasture. The storm that almost killed Earl didn't look like much when he first spotted it on the western horizon. Just a gray smudge against the sky, maybe 15 miles out, not even tall enough to hide the mountains behind it. If Earl had been relying on visual appearance alone, he might have figured he had an hour or more before the weather got serious. But Earl wasn't just watching the clouds, he was watching the whole sky, reading the story it was telling about pressure systems and wind patterns and electrical charges, building up in ways that don't show up on weather radar. The first thing Earl noticed was the wind shift. For most of the day, the breeze had been coming from the south, carrying the smell of sage and dry grass. Then, gradually, it shifted to the west, bringing with it the metallic smell that often precedes electrical storms. Not a dramatic change. Most people wouldn't have noticed it at all. But Earl had been working outdoors long enough to know that when the wind changes direction for no apparent reason, you pay attention. The second thing Earl noticed was the way the light changed. It's hard to describe if you haven't seen it, but there's a particular quality to the light before a thunderstorm that's different from regular overcast conditions. Everything looks sharper, more defined, like someone adjusted the contrast on a television screen. Colors become more vivid. Shadows become darker and more distinct. This happens because of the way light behaves when it passes through air that's been electrically charged. The same electrical field that makes your hair stand up also affects the way light waves travel, creating that hyper-real quality that makes everything look like it's been outlined in black ink. Earl noticed the light change about 15 minutes before he heard the first thunder. Combined with the wind shift and the animal behavior he'd been watching all morning, it told him everything he needed to know about what was coming his way. The third sign Earl picked up on was something most people never notice because they're not paying attention to the right details: the way sound carries differently before a storm. You know how some days your voice seems to carry farther than usual, and other days it seems like sounds get muffled even in open country? That's not your imagination. That's atmospheric pressure affecting the way sound waves travel. Before a thunderstorm hits, falling air pressure creates what acoustics experts call a sound shadow, a zone where normal sounds seem dampened and distant sounds seem closer. Earl noticed this when he could suddenly hear his neighbor's tractor working a field 2 miles away, even though the same tractor had been running all morning without Earl being aware of it. When you can hear distant sounds more clearly than usual and nearby sounds seem muffled, that's the atmosphere telling you that the air pressure is dropping fast. And when air pressure drops fast, storms aren't far behind. But here's the thing about reading these traditional weather signs. They work better than modern forecasting for immediate, localized threats, but they require you to pay attention to details that most of us have trained ourselves to ignore. We live in a world of weather apps and radar screens and professional meteorologists who can tell you what the weather will be like next Tuesday. But all that technology is useless if you don't have cell service, or if the storm that's about to kill you is moving faster than the radar updates. or if you're dealing with one of those localized microbursts that pop up and disappear between weather observations. Earl's grandfather didn't have weather apps. He had something better, 40 years of watching the same piece of sky and learning to read the story it was telling. He knew that when the cottonwoods along the creek turned their leaves belly up, rain was coming within the hour. He knew that when the barn cats went looking for high ground, the storm would bring hail. He knew that when the air pressure dropped fast enough to make his old war wound ache, the lightning would be close behind. This kind of weather wisdom isn't superstition. It's pattern recognition based on decades of careful observation. And while you might not have 40 years to develop those same instincts, you can learn to recognize the most important signs in a single season of paying attention. The key is understanding that weather doesn't happen in isolation. Every storm is part of a larger system, and that system starts broadcasting its intentions long before the thunder and lightning show up. Think of it like this. If lightning is the punch that knocks you out, then the early warning signs are the opponent telegraphing his moves. You can see the punch coming if you know what to look for, but you have to be watching for the right signals. Earl was watching for the right signals that afternoon. That's why he wasn't surprised when the storm hit, even though it moved in faster and hit harder than the weather service had predicted. But knowing a storm is coming is only half the battle. The other half is knowing what to do about it once you realize you're in the crosshairs. And that's where Earl's story takes a turn that might surprise you, because what happened in the 20 minutes after that first lightning strike taught him something about thunderstorm behavior that most people never learn, even if they survive multiple close calls. Something about the way storms hunt, and the way they remember, and the way they sometimes seem to hold grudges against specific pieces of ground. Earl was about to discover that the lightning strike he just survived wasn't a random event. It was reconnaissance. The storm was testing the ground, learning the terrain, figuring out where the best targets were hiding. And Earl, crouched in the middle of that pasture, with his ears still ringing from the thunder, was about to get a front row seat to a demonstration of how intelligent a force of nature can be when it's looking for something to kill. What happened next would change everything Earl thought he knew about lightning behavior and teach him the one lesson about thunderstorm survival that you won't find in any safety manual. Sometimes, the smartest thing you can do is exactly what every instinct tells you not to do. Earl stayed in that lightning crouch for 3 more minutes, watching the storm and trying to figure out his next move. The smart money said to stay put. He'd just survived one lightning strike by staying low, so why mess with success? But Earl's gut was telling him something different. The storm wasn't moving on like storms usually did. Instead of rolling past his position and continuing east toward Laramie, this one seemed to be circling back like a predator that had caught the scent of something interesting. That's when Earl made a decision that saved his life. Even though it went against every piece of lightning safety advice he'd ever heard, he got up and ran, not toward his truck. That was still 3 miles away across open ground. Not toward the oak tree. He'd already figured out that tall, isolated trees were lightning magnets. Earl ran toward the one place every safety manual will tell you never to go during a thunderstorm: a barbed wire fence. Now, before you write Earl off as a man who'd lost his mind under pressure, understand that Earl had been reading storms for 43 years. He'd seen lightning behavior that most people never witness, because most people have the good sense to be indoors when storms get serious. Earl had watched lightning hit the same oak tree 3 times in 15 years. He'd seen it follow fence lines for half a mile, jumping from post to post like it was following a road map. He'd seen it strike the same spot on his barn roof 4 separate times, until he finally figured out there was an old iron pipe buried in the ground directly underneath that spot. In other words, Earl understood something about lightning that separates survivors from statistics. Lightning doesn't just strike randomly. It has preferences. It follows patterns. And sometimes those patterns can be used against it. The barbed wire fence Earl ran toward was different from most fences in one crucial way: it wasn't grounded. The wooden posts were set in rocky ground that didn't conduct electricity well, and the wire itself was old and rusty, full of breaks and gaps that would interrupt any electrical current trying to travel along it. More importantly, the fence ran along a depression in the ground, a natural drainage that would put Earl 10 feet lower than the surrounding terrain. In lightning terms, that 10-foot difference might as well have been 10 miles. Earl reached the fence line just as the second lightning bolt hit, striking the exact spot where he'd been crouched 30 seconds earlier. The blast was close enough that he felt the heat on his back, and the shockwave knocked him flat against the ground. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was starting to understand how this particular storm hunted. That lightning didn't just hit where I'd been, Earl told me years later. It hit where I'd been because I'd been there, like it could smell where I'd been standing or sense the heat from my body or something. I don't know the science behind it, but I know what I saw. What Earl saw was a demonstration of something that gets people killed in thunderstorms more often than any other single factor: the assumption that lightning strikes are random events that can't be predicted or avoided. That assumption leads to the kind of thinking that turns smart, experienced people into lightning casualties. Thinking like, the odds of getting struck are so low that I don't need to worry about it. Or, if I'm going to get hit, there's nothing I can do about it anyway. Or, lightning never strikes the same place twice. All of those statements are not just wrong, they're dangerous, because they lead to the kind of casual decision-making that puts you in the wrong place at the wrong time, when 100 million volts of electricity are looking for the path of least resistance to the ground. Take that business about lightning never striking the same place twice. That's one of those old sayings that sounds wise until you think about it for 5 seconds. Lightning strikes the Empire State Building about 25 times a year. It hit Roy Sullivan, a park ranger in Virginia, 7 separate times during his 35-year career. Earl's oak tree got hit 3 times in 15 years. Lightning strikes the same places repeatedly because the conditions that make a place attractive to lightning, height, conductivity, isolation, don't change. If anything, getting struck by lightning makes a location more likely to get struck again because the electrical discharge can leave traces of conductive material in the ground that act like a roadmap for future strikes. This is why the biggest mistake you can make in a thunderstorm is assuming that your common sense and general life experience will keep you safe. Lightning operates by rules that have nothing to do with fairness, logic, or the way you think the world should work. Let me tell you about a camping trip that went sideways in Colorado back in the summer of 2003, because it illustrates just how deadly smart thinking can be when you're dealing with a fundamentally unreasonable force of nature. 3 guys from Denver, Jim Walsh, Mike Torres, and Dave Chen, had been planning this trip for months. All 3 were experienced outdoorsmen in their 50s, the kind of guys who knew their way around the backcountry and didn't take unnecessary risks. Jim was a retired firefighter who'd seen enough preventable accidents to be cautious about safety. Mike was an engineer who approached problems methodically and always had backup plans for his backup plans. Dave was a former Army medic who could handle himself in an emergency. They were hiking a section of the Colorado Trail near Mount Elbert, about 8 miles into a 3-day trip, when they noticed clouds building to the west. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of afternoon thunderheads that are common in the Rockies during summer. The weather forecast had called for a 30% chance of scattered showers, nothing that would make an experienced hiker think twice about being on the trail. But these guys had been around long enough to know that mountain weather can change fast. When they heard the first distant rumble, they immediately started looking for shelter. Now, here's where their experience and intelligence almost got them killed. The nearest official shelter was a trail hut about 2 miles further up the mountain. 2 miles doesn't sound like much, but they were already at 11,000 feet elevation. The trail was steep, and they could hear the thunder getting closer. They estimated it would take them at least 45 minutes to reach the hut, and they didn't think they had 45 minutes. So they did what any reasonable, experienced group of hikers would do. They looked for the best available shelter they could reach quickly. About 200 yards off the trail, they spotted what looked like the perfect place to wait out the storm, a shallow cave formed by an overhang of granite. big enough for all three of them, high enough to sit up in and dry. It looked like nature's version of a trail shelter, and it was only 5 minutes away. Jim, the firefighter, was the first to suggest it. "That cave looks solid," he said. "Good rock overhead, no loose stuff that might fall. We can wait this thing out and be back on the trail in an hour." Mike, the engineer, liked the location because it was positioned to shed water away from the opening. "Good drainage," he observed. "We won't be sitting in a puddle if this thing dumps rain." Dave, the medic, was thinking about worst-case scenarios. "If somebody gets hurt, at least we'll have decent shelter while we figure out what to do next." All three of them were thinking like the experienced, intelligent men they were. They evaluated their options, chose the one that seemed safest and most practical, and acted quickly and decisively. They made exactly the kind of smart, reasonable decision that gets people killed in lightning storms. Because what none of them knew, what they couldn't have known without specific training in lightning behavior, was that caves and overhangs are some of the most dangerous places you can be during a thunderstorm. Here's why. When lightning strikes the ground near a cave opening, the electrical current doesn't just dissipate harmlessly into the earth. It follows the path of least resistance, which often means traveling along the surface of the rock and into the cave, where it can bounce around like a pinball looking for a way out. If you're in that cave when the lightning comes calling, you become part of the electrical circuit. The current can enter through your feet, travel up through your body, and exit through your head, or any other combination that physics finds convenient. People have been killed by lightning strikes that hit the ground 50 feet away from the cave they thought was protecting them. But Jim, Mike, and Dave didn't know any of this. They were thinking about the cave the way most people think about caves, as shelter from the elements, a place to stay dry and comfortable while the storm passed over. They made it to the cave just as the first raindrops started falling. Jim even commented on their good timing as they settled in to wait out the storm. "Perfect," he said. "Beats the hell out of getting soaked." For the first 10 minutes, everything seemed fine. They sat in the cave opening, watching the rain come down and the lightning flash in the distance, feeling pretty good about their decision-making. The storm looked impressive, but not particularly threatening, just the kind of summer thunderstorm that blows through the mountains and moves on. Then the lightning got serious. The first strike hit a tree about 100 yards away, close enough that they could smell the ozone and see the smoke rising from the bark. That got their attention, but they still felt relatively safe. After all, they were in a cave, protected by solid rock overhead. The second strike hit closer, maybe 75 yards away. The thunder was loud enough to hurt their ears, but they told themselves they were still in good shape. Better to be in the cave than caught in the open. The third strike changed everything. It hit the granite ledge directly above their cave, and instead of dissipating harmlessly into the rock, the electrical current followed a crack in the stone and traveled down the back wall of the cave like water flowing down a drain pipe. Dave, who was sitting with his back against the wall, took the full hit. It was like watching someone get hit with an invisible sledgehammer, Mike told the investigators later. Dave just convulsed. His whole body went rigid, then he collapsed. "I thought he was dead." Dave wasn't dead, but he was unconscious and not breathing. Jim, the firefighter, immediately started CPR, while Mike ran out into the storm to activate their emergency beacon. It took search and rescue 4 hours to reach them through the rain and lightning, and another 3 hours to get Dave down the mountain to a medical helicopter. Dave survived, but just barely. He spent 2 weeks in a coma and another month learning to walk again. The lightning had affected his nervous system in ways that took months of physical therapy to overcome. To this day, he can't feel anything in his left hand, and he gets disoriented during thunderstorms, even if he's safe inside a building. Jim and Mike, who were sitting closer to the cave opening, escaped with minor burns and temporary hearing loss. But they learned something that night that changed the way they think about outdoor safety forever. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is exactly what every instinct tells you not to do. If they'd stayed on the trail in the open, away from tall trees and rock formations, they probably would have gotten wet and maybe a little scared, but they wouldn't have been in serious danger. By seeking the kind of shelter that seems most reasonable, solid overhead protection, they put themselves in the path of an electrical current that could have killed all three of them. This is the paradox of lightning safety. The actions that seem most logical often put you in the greatest danger. Your instincts tell you to seek high ground so you can see the storm coming. But high ground is where lightning strikes first and hardest. Your instincts tell you to take shelter under tall trees. But trees are lightning magnets, and when they get hit, they turn into 50-foot tall electric whips that can kill you from 30 feet away. Your instincts tell you to find solid overhead protection, like caves or rock overhangs. But enclosed spaces can turn into electrical death traps when the current starts bouncing around, looking for a way out. Your instincts tell you to keep moving towards safety when you hear thunder. But moving during a lightning storm can put you in more danger than staying put, especially if you're running toward the kinds of shelter that attract lightning. This is why lightning kills smart people just as often as it kills careless people. Intelligence doesn't help you when the rules you're operating by are fundamentally wrong. Earl figured this out that afternoon in the pasture, watching the storm hunt him like something with a brain and a grudge. Every move he'd made based on conventional wisdom, getting low, staying small, avoiding tall objects, had worked to keep him alive. But the storm kept coming back, kept targeting the spots where he'd been, like it was learning his patterns and trying to anticipate his next move. That's when Earl realized that surviving this storm wasn't going to be about following rules. It was going to be about understanding his enemy well enough to think like it thought. But first, he had to figure out what that enemy was really looking for and why it seemed so determined to find him specifically. Because the thing about lightning that most people never learn, the thing that can save your life if you understand it, or kill you if you don't, is that lightning doesn't just strike objects. It strikes the ground beneath objects. And that ground has memory. Earl was about to discover that the patch of Wyoming pasture he'd chosen for his afternoon fence check wasn't just any piece of ground. It was ground that lightning had been visiting for decades, ground that held traces of iron and copper and other conductive materials left behind by previous strikes. Ground that was, in electrical terms, already lit up like a Christmas tree and broadcasting its location to every charged cloud within 50 miles. Earl had wandered into the middle of nature's version of a shooting gallery, and he was about to learn why the best lightning safety advice in the world won't help you if you don't understand the difference between where lightning strikes and where lightning wants to strike. Earl was starting to understand that he'd stumbled into something bigger than just a typical Wyoming thunderstorm. This wasn't random weather looking for random targets. This storm was hunting specific ground, and that ground happened to be right where he was standing. But understanding the problem and solving it are two different things entirely. Earl's next decision almost killed him, and it illustrates something that gets even experienced outdoorsmen into serious trouble. The difference between knowing what not to do and knowing what to do when every option looks dangerous. From his position by the barbed wire fence, Earl could see three possible escape routes. None of them looked particularly appealing. Option 1, head back toward his truck, 3 miles across open pasture. That meant crossing the same ground where lightning had already struck twice, with no cover and no way to get low, except to lie flat in the grass and hope the storm moved on. Option 2, follow the fence line toward the county road, about 1.5 miles away. The fence would give him something to navigate by in the rain, but it also meant traveling alongside a potential conductor for the entire distance. Option 3, cut across the creek bottom toward his neighbor's barn, maybe 2 miles through rough country, but with the advantage of lower elevation and some scattered cottonwoods for reference points. Each option violated basic lightning safety rules. Open ground made him a target. The fence could conduct electricity. The creek bottom would flood if the storm brought heavy rain, and those cottonwoods were just more tall, isolated trees waiting to get zapped. Earl chose option 4. He stayed put and started digging. Now, this might sound like the decision of a man who'd been rattled by too many close calls, but Earl had learned something that afternoon that most people never figure out. even if they live through multiple lightning encounters. Sometimes the best way to deal with ground that attracts lightning is to get yourself off that ground entirely. Using a flat rock and his bare hands, Earl started scraping out a shallow depression in the dirt beside the fence, just deep enough to lie flat with his body below the level of the surrounding ground. It wasn't much of an excavation, maybe 6 inches deep, and just long enough for a man to stretch out flat. But those 6 inches might have saved his life, because what Earl understood instinctively, without knowing the scientific terminology, was something called step potential, the phenomenon that kills more people in lightning storms than direct strikes. Here's how step potential works, explained in terms that don't require a degree in electrical engineering. When lightning hits the ground, it doesn't just disappear. That electrical current spreads out through the earth in all directions, looking for the path of least resistance to dissipate its energy. The current is strongest right at the point of impact, but it can still be deadly for 30 feet or more in every direction. Now, if you're standing upright when that current hits the ground near you, your feet become 2 different contact points with the electrified earth. The electrical current wants to flow from the point of higher voltage, the foot closer to the lightning strike, to the point of lower voltage, the foot farther from the strike. And the easiest path for that current to take is up one leg through your body and down the other leg. 30 amperes of electrical current is enough to kill a man. Lightning can put 30,000 amperes into the ground. This is why you'll sometimes hear about entire herds of cattle getting killed by a single lightning strike. It's not because the lightning hit each animal individually. It's because they were all standing on electrified ground with their feet spread apart, creating perfect pathways for the electrical current to flow through their bodies. It's also why that advice about rubber-soled shoes protecting you from lightning is not just wrong. It's dangerously wrong. Rubber soles might protect you from household electrical current, the kind that comes out of wall outlets at 120 volts. But lightning is carrying millions of volts. At that level of electrical potential, a 1/4 inch of rubber might as well be tissue paper. The current will punch right through your boot soles and into your feet without slowing down. Worse, believing that your hiking boots will protect you can lead to exactly the kind of overconfidence that gets people killed. You start thinking you can take risks that you wouldn't take in bare feet, when the reality is that your footwear makes no difference at all. What does make a difference is the position of your body relative to the electrified ground. If you can minimize the distance between your feet, better yet, if you can keep your feet touching each other, you minimize the voltage differential that can develop between your contact points with the ground. And if you can get your body as low as possible, you reduce the chances of being the tallest object in the immediate area. This is the science behind the lightning crouch that saved Earl's life earlier that afternoon. But Earl was starting to realize that even the lightning crouch might not be enough if the storm kept targeting the same piece of ground. So he dug himself a shallow grave in the Wyoming dirt and laid down in it, flat on his stomach with his feet together and his hands covering his ears. It felt like giving up. It looked like surrender. It probably saved his life. The third lightning strike hit about 20 feet away, close enough that Earl could feel the heat through his shirt and smell his own hair getting singed. But the electrical current that spread through the ground passed over his prostrate body instead of through it. Lying flat in that little ditch, I could actually feel the electricity in the ground, Earl told me, like a vibration or a hum. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, then it was gone. But for those 2 seconds, I knew that if I'd been standing up or even crouched, that current would have gone right through me. Earl stayed in that shallow depression for another 10 minutes while the storm moved on, listening to the thunder get more distant and feeling the electrical charge in the air gradually dissipate. When he finally stood up, the hair on his arms was no longer standing on end, and the metallic taste in his mouth, something he hadn't even noticed until it was gone, had disappeared. But Earl's education in lightning behavior wasn't over yet. As he walked back toward his truck, Earl started noticing things about the ground that he'd never paid attention to before. Small details that suddenly seemed significant in light of what he'd just experienced. The spot where the first lightning bolt had hit wasn't just where that old survey stake had been driven into the ground 40 years ago. It was also where an underground spring came close to the surface, creating a patch of ground that stayed moist even during dry spells. Moisture conducts electricity better than dry soil. The spot where the second bolt had hit was where Earl had been standing, but it was also directly over an old buried fence line that had been removed decades ago, but had left traces of iron wire in the soil. Metal conducts electricity better than dirt. The spot where the third bolt had hit was where an old cattle trail crossed the fence line, creating a depression in the ground where runoff collected and minerals concentrated. Mineral deposits conduct electricity better than regular soil. In other words, the lightning wasn't just striking randomly, it was following a map written in the ground itself, targeting spots where decades of human activity and natural processes had created the most conductive pathways to the earth. This is why some pieces of ground get hit by lightning repeatedly, while other areas, sometimes just a few yards away, never get struck at all. It's not just about height or isolation or the presence of metal objects. It's about the electrical properties of the earth itself, and those properties can vary dramatically over very short distances. Earl had wandered into what amounted to nature's version of a minefield, where each mine was a patch of ground that lightning found irresistibly attractive. But here's the thing that separates lightning survivors from lightning casualties. Once you understand how the enemy thinks, you can use that knowledge to your advantage. Earl realized that the storm hadn't been hunting him personally. It had been hunting specific pieces of ground that happened to be in his vicinity. The lightning wasn't following Earl. Earl had been moving through a series of locations that the lightning wanted to hit anyway. This insight changed everything about how Earl thought about lightning safety. Instead of trying to make himself invisible to lightning, Earl started thinking about how to position himself relative to the ground that lightning actually wanted to hit. Instead of avoiding all conductive materials, he started thinking about how to use his knowledge of conductivity to predict where lightning would strike and make sure he wasn't there when it happened. In other words, Earl stopped playing defense and started playing chess. This shift in thinking, from avoiding lightning to understanding lightning, is what separates people who survive multiple close encounters from people who get killed by their first one. Most lightning safety advice focuses on the things you shouldn't do. Don't stand under trees, don't hold metal objects, don't stay in high places. All of that advice is correct, but it's essentially defensive. It tells you how to avoid being an attractive target, but it doesn't tell you how to predict where lightning will strike next. Understanding step potential and ground conductivity gives you something more valuable than defensive tactics. It gives you the ability to read the terrain the way lightning reads it, and position yourself accordingly. For example, if you're caught in the open during a thunderstorm, conventional wisdom says to find the lowest available ground and assume the lightning crouch. That's good advice, but it's incomplete. Better advice? Find the lowest available ground that's also away from anything that might create conductive pathways through the earth. Stay away from wet areas, metal objects, underground utilities, old foundations, and anywhere water tends to collect or flow. If you're hiking in the mountains, conventional wisdom says to get off ridges and peaks. Again, good advice, but incomplete. Better advice, get off ridges and peaks, but also stay away from dry creek beds, mineral deposits, and areas where mining activity might have left metal debris in the soil. If you're camping, conventional wisdom says to avoid tall trees and metal tent poles. Correct, but not complete. Better advice, choose a campsite that's not just away from tall objects, but also away from underground water sources, buried utilities, and anywhere the ground composition changes dramatically over short distances. This kind of terrain reading takes practice, but the basic principles are straightforward enough that any experienced outdoorsman can learn them in a single season. The key is learning to think like electricity thinks. Electricity is lazy. It always takes the path of least resistance. If you can predict where that path will be, you can make sure you're not on it when 100 million volts come looking for a way to the ground. Earl figured this out, lying in a shallow depression he'd scraped out with his bare hands, feeling electrical current flow through the earth beneath his prostrate body. It wasn't scientific knowledge that saved him. It was practical understanding gained through direct experience with a force of nature that doesn't care about your theories or your safety plans. But Earl's real education was just beginning, because what he learned in the next 20 minutes, as the storm moved off toward the east and he made his way back to his truck, would teach him something about lightning behavior that might surprise you. Lightning has a memory, and sometimes that memory can work in your favor if you're smart enough to understand what it's remembering and why. Earl was about to discover that the ground he'd just survived wasn't just conductive because of old survey stakes and buried fence lines and underground springs. It was conductive because it had been struck by lightning so many times over the decades that it had become a kind of electrical highway carved into the earth by repeated strikes and marked with traces of conductive material that accumulated over time. In other words, Earl had been standing in the middle of nature's version of a lightning rod, a piece of ground that had been shaped by electricity itself into the perfect target for more electricity. Understanding this would give Earl the key to something most people never learn: how to read the signs that tell you where lightning has struck before and use that knowledge to predict where it will strike next. Because lightning doesn't just strike the same place twice. Sometimes it strikes the same place 20 times, 30 times, 50 times over the course of decades, each strike making the ground more attractive to the next one. And if you know how to recognize those places, you can avoid them entirely instead of stumbling into them like Earl had done that afternoon. Earl made it back to his truck that afternoon with a new understanding of how lightning hunts. But he also carried with him a nagging question that would change how he approached Thunderstorm safety for the rest of his life. If that storm had found him again, what would he have done differently? Because the truth is, everything Earl had done right that day, reading the early warning signs, recognizing the danger, getting low when the lightning started flying, still left him trapped in the open with nowhere to go when the storm decided to get serious. All the knowledge in the world about step potential and ground conductivity doesn't help much if you're standing in the middle of a lightning-friendly patch of earth with no way to get somewhere safer. At some point, knowing what not to do has to give way to knowing exactly what to do when you're out of options and the sky starts shooting back. This is where most lightning safety advice falls short. It's great at telling you how to avoid getting into trouble, but it's not much help once you're already in trouble. Earl spent the next few years collecting stories from other folks who'd found themselves in similar situations. Ranchers, hunters, hikers, anyone who'd been caught in the open during serious electrical weather. What he learned was that the people who walked away from close encounters with lightning all seemed to understand a few basic principles that don't get talked about much in the standard safety courses. The first principle Earl learned from a Marine named Carlos Mendoza, who'd survived a lightning strike during a training exercise at Camp Pendleton back in 1987. Carlos and his squad were running a night navigation course when a storm rolled in faster than anyone expected. Standard military protocol called for immediate shelter, but they were 8 miles from the nearest building, and the lightning was already close enough to make the hair on their arms stand up. That's when Carlos remembered something from his basic training that had nothing to do with lightning and everything to do with staying alive when incoming artillery was looking for targets. In the Marines, they teach you that when the shooting starts, you make yourself as small a target as possible, Carlos told Earl years later. Get low, get compact, minimize your profile. Lightning's just electricity looking for the easiest path to ground, right? So I figured the same principle ought to apply. Carlos dropped into what became known in his unit as the lightning crouch, a position that looks about as ridiculous as it sounds, but that might be the most important piece of practical knowledge anyone spending time outdoors can learn. Here's how you do the lightning crouch. Squat down on the balls of your feet, keeping your feet as close together as possible, ideally touching. Pull your knees up to your chest and wrap your arms around your legs. Tuck your head down toward your knees. Keep your hands off the ground. If you need to balance, touch only your fingertips to the earth, never your palms. The position looks like something between a catcher's crouch and a yoga pose, and it feels just as awkward as it looks. Your legs will start cramping after a few minutes. Your balance will be terrible. You'll feel exposed and vulnerable, and probably more than a little foolish. But the lightning crouch works for 3 reasons that have nothing to do with how it looks and everything to do with physics. First, it minimizes your height while keeping you off the ground. You're not the tallest object in the area, but you're also not lying flat where step potential can kill you if lightning hits nearby. Second, it minimizes the distance between your feet, which minimizes the voltage differential that can develop if electrical current flows through the ground beneath you. Third, it minimizes the contact area between your body and the ground, which reduces the chances of electrical current finding a pathway through you to reach the earth. Carlos and his squad stayed in the lightning crouch for 23 minutes while the storm passed over their position. Lightning hit the ground close enough that they could smell ozone and feel heat from the strikes, but all 7 Marines walked away without injury. Did we look like idiots squatting in the dirt like a bunch of scared prairie dogs? Carlos asked. Hell yes. Did we care? Hell no. Looking stupid is a small price to pay for staying alive. The second principle Earl learned came from understanding why Carlos and his squad all survived that night. While other groups caught in similar situations didn't fare as well, it wasn't just the lightning crouch that saved them. It was also the spacing. Military training teaches soldiers to spread out when they're under fire, because a single artillery shell or grenade can't take out an entire unit if the members aren't clustered together. The same principle applies to lightning, but for different reasons. If you're caught in the open with other people during a thunderstorm, your instinct is to stick together. It feels safer to huddle up, and psychologically, it probably is safer. Having other people around reduces the panic and helps everyone think more clearly. But from a lightning safety standpoint, clustering together can turn a single strike into a mass casualty event. Here's why. When lightning hits the ground near a group of people, the electrical current spreads out in all directions through the earth. If the people are close together, that current can flow from person to person through the ground, essentially using human bodies as conductors to carry the electrical charge across a wider area. This is how you get situations where lightning strikes the ground 50 feet away from a group of hikers, and 3 people get injured, even though none of them took a direct hit. Carlos's squad survived because their training had taught them to spread out automatically in any dangerous situation. When they went into the lightning crouch, they positioned themselves at least 15 feet apart from each other. That 15-foot spacing isn't arbitrary. It's based on the distance that step potential typically travels through average soil conditions. By staying at least 15 feet apart, the Marines ensured that if lightning hit near one of them, the electrical current flowing through the ground wouldn't reach the others. 15 feet sounds like a lot when you're scared and you want to stick close to your buddies, Carlos explained. But it's not so far that you can't communicate. You can still see each other, still coordinate your movements. You just can't help each other if the lightning comes calling. This spacing principle matters even if you're not with a group. If you're caught alone in the open, you want to position yourself at least 15 feet away from any large objects, trees, rocks, fence posts, anything that might attract lightning or conduct electricity through the ground. But here's where the spacing principle gets tricky. Sometimes 15 feet isn't far enough, and sometimes it's too far to be practical. Earl learned this from a hunting guide named Ben Yazzie, who'd been guiding clients in the Arizona high country for 26 years when Earl met him at an outdoor skills conference in Flagstaff. Ben had been caught in lightning storms more times than he could count, usually with clients who were depending on him to keep them alive. Over the years, Ben had developed what he called the gear protocol, a set of simple rules for what to do with your equipment when you're caught in the open and every second counts. Most folks don't think about their gear when the lightning starts flying, Ben told Earl. They're too busy trying not to get killed. But your gear can either save your life or get you killed, depending on how you handle it. The gear protocol starts with one simple rule. If you're wearing or carrying anything metal, get rid of it immediately. That means your watch, your belt buckle, the coins in your pocket, the knife on your hip, the trekking poles in your hands. If it's metal and it's not essential for immediate survival, drop it and get at least 10 feet away from it. This isn't because metal objects attract lightning. That's another one of those myths that sounds logical but isn't actually true. Lightning doesn't seek out metal objects any more than it seeks out tall objects or wet objects or any other specific type of target. But metal objects do conduct electricity extremely well. If you're holding a metal trekking pole when lightning strikes nearby, that pole can channel electrical current directly into your body, even if the lightning hits the ground 50 feet away. The same principle applies to anything else that conducts electricity well. Wet clothing, cell phones, GPS units, cameras with metal components. If it can carry an electrical charge, you don't want it in contact with your body when there's electricity in the air. Ben's second gear rule: create a buffer between yourself and the ground using your pack or other non-conductive materials. Most hiking packs have enough synthetic materials and padding to provide some insulation between your body and the earth. It's not perfect insulation. Nothing you're likely to be carrying will completely protect you from a serious electrical current, but it's better than direct contact with the ground. I tell my clients to sit on their packs when they go into the lightning crouch, Ben explained. Keeps them a little higher off the ground, gives them a little bit of insulation. Is it going to save you from a direct lightning strike? Probably not, but it might save you from step potential if lightning hits somewhere nearby. Ben's third gear rule: use your equipment to mark safe spacing, even when you're alone. If you're by yourself and you need to maintain safe distance from trees or rocks or other potential lightning attractors, drop pieces of your gear at 15-foot intervals to give yourself visual reference points. A water bottle here, a stuff sack there, whatever you can spare to help you judge distances in conditions where visibility might be poor and your judgment might be compromised by stress. When you're scared and it's raining and the thunder's booming all around you, it's easy to misjudge distances, Ben said. You think you're far enough away from that big pine tree, but you're actually only 8 feet away instead of 15. Your gear can help you get the spacing right. But Ben's most important piece of advice had to do with something that most people never consider when they're planning their lightning safety strategy. What do you do if someone in your group gets hit? This question matters because lightning strikes, while often fatal, aren't always fatal. People do survive direct lightning hits, and they survive them more often than most folks realize. But survival often depends on getting the right help in the first few minutes after the strike. The biggest mistake people make when someone gets hit by lightning is thinking the person is dead and there's nothing they can do, Ben explained. But lightning kills in very specific ways, and most of those ways are reversible if you act fast enough. Lightning can stop your heart, but CPR can start it again. Lightning can stop your breathing, but rescue breathing can keep you alive until your respiratory system recovers. Lightning can cause severe burns, but burn treatment can minimize permanent damage. What lightning can't do is leave a person electrified or dangerous to touch. That's pure Hollywood nonsense. The electrical current from a lightning strike passes through the body and into the ground in a fraction of a second. By the time you can reach a lightning strike victim, there's no residual electricity in their body and no danger to you from touching them. Ben had personally performed CPR on 2 different lightning strike victims over the years, and both had survived. Not without injuries. One spent 3 months recovering from burns and nerve damage, and the other had hearing problems that lasted for years, but both walked out of the backcountry alive. If someone in your group gets hit, you've got maybe 10 minutes to make a difference, Ben said. 10 minutes to get their heart started again, get them breathing again, treat them for shock and burns. After that, their chances start dropping fast. But in those first 10 minutes, you can literally save a life if you know what you're doing. This brings us to something that separates lightning survivors from lightning casualties that has nothing to do with reading the weather or understanding electrical physics or knowing the right body positions. It has to do with having a plan for what happens after the lightning strikes. Because Earl learned something that afternoon in the Wyoming pasture that changed how he thought about thunderstorm safety forever. Surviving the lightning strike is only half the battle. The other half is surviving the aftermath, when you might be injured or disoriented or stranded miles from help with a storm still raging around you. And that's where Earl's story takes another turn, because what happened on his drive home that afternoon taught him that sometimes the most dangerous part of a lightning encounter isn't the lightning itself. It's what you do next, when you think the danger is over, but you're still in the middle of nowhere with storm clouds building on the horizon and the radio crackling with emergency broadcasts about flash flood warnings and tornado sightings and power lines down across half the county. Earl was about to learn that surviving lightning is just the beginning of staying alive in severe weather. The real test comes when you have to navigate your way home through country that's been turned upside down by a storm system that's just getting started.